issues. One, if you feel an urge, the washrooms are down the hall and to your right. And if those ones are full, you can walk a little further.
Everyone, hi. Am I supposed to do something or not do something?
Don't do anything. Just look beautiful.
I'm going to freeze here. Okay, is this better?
It's better.
We could just forego the mic altogether, but right. So hi everyone, I'm Phil Letourneau. I'm the director of visual design for a company called Black Pixel. I'm going to talk to you tonight about designing apps primarily for mobile and primarily for iPhone, but the things you're going to learn tonight apply to pretty much all mediums of interaction design and user interface design, and I hope that you get something out of it, even if you're not directly involved in, say, designing iPhone apps. I'm going to open this up with one of my favorite XKCD comics. This is a Venn diagram. On one side, you see the things on the front page of a university website, such as a campus photo slideshow, alumni in the news, press releases. On the other side, on the right, you see things people go to the site looking for, and that's a list of faculty phone numbers, campus address, parking information. And the only thing in common is the full name of the school. And this really speaks to kind of the state of user interface design, the things that we try as user interface designers to blend together, is really get people the things that they're looking for. And really putting users first. That's the most important thing to remember when designing any kind of software for any platform, anywhere, anytime. And so the format of the presentation tonight, I'm going to start off with, throughout the majority of the presentation, I'm going to have a case study of an application that was designed prior to my starting at Black Pixel. It's an application called Drug Hub. It was designed for Great West Life locally here. Yeah, we've got some representation in the crowd. And before I even start anything, or continue my presentation, I'm going to go right into a demo of Drug Hub, just to give you guys a quick idea of what it does and how it works. Okay, just going to bring my iPhone up here. Yeah, all my live demos are going to work great tonight, I can tell. Yeah, I have 2 solid-state drives in this computer. You can see it peeking out here. This is, hopefully your phone's more responsive than my simulator. And I may just force quit and... I'll warn you in advance that one of my other demos involves Photoshop, so I'm sure you can look forward to even more excitement. And I even tested this beforehand. Okay, well, I guess we may just forego the demo. Oh. Yeah, it's not going to launch. We're not going to see it work at all. 5, 4, 3. Oh, okay. So now this isn't reflective of the performance of the app itself. I'll just point that out. And if this demo starts to be difficult, we'll just skip it. Well, the first thing you see when you're greeted in this application is just kind of a welcome message and an empty set of shelves. And there's actually only just a single button on the welcoming screen. Oh, wow. And so you can scroll up and down through the shelves and just get an idea of what the space that this app occupies. Okay, screw it. We're just going to, well, yeah, forget it.
Oh, it's there.
Oh, of course. It's testing me. So you flip the cabinet over. There's actually a flip transition there, and you get to the back of it. And from here, you can actually very simply search for any prescription drug that you might be on. Yeah, no, I'm not doing this. Okay, let's switch over. I'm not even going to. Yeah, it's a big tease. So that was Drug Hub. Thank you. So I'll just quickly go through the list of features. But essentially, you get to the application. The first screen you see is this one. I've got a few slides here that show you kind of the details that went into the design. So you have a list of shelves, you have a button in the top right corner that lets you get to the pharmacy, at which point you can do a search and find medication that you are currently taking. It doesn't need to be prescription, it has a fairly extensive database. And what you can do is you can actually tap on any of these rows on the left side of the row to get some information about the drug if it's something that you haven't taken yet. Or you can immediately just click on the tap on the plus on the right side to just add that drug to your cabinet. When you go to add the drug to your cabinet, you're presented with a list of criteria that you enter in to tell the app how many tablets you have, or if it's a liquid, how many milliliters you have. And you go through the list and just tick things off. There's actually I don't think there's any required fields on here. And the idea is that we want users who want to be as specific as they want to have that flexibility, but also users that just want to get in and out very quickly are able to do so as well. And I'm going to touch on some of these things throughout the app, but all of the iconography, everything is completely custom designed for this specific application, which is something that is really helps polish an app, is if you can have the things in your app, the graphics in your app, if they can be done custom for your application, you're going to get that much more of a polished product. The idea is that everything in this application is designed around the specific purposes of this application. And actually, I'm just going to call out my little brother, Patrick, here. He actually, he designed some of the 3D models that you're going to see in the application. So if you're looking for any 3D work, he's the guy. So, and starting on this screen here. And so once you've added the drug to your application, to your shelf, they actually show up like so. And the containers are representative of what the drug is. Now, we could have easily made an application that just had a list of all the drugs and just take those names and, or even just leave an empty field where someone could just type in the name of their drug. But as you know, drug names can be quite lengthy. These ones are actually pretty tame ones. But we went to the extent of where we spent a lot of time polishing even the database of information we were putting in here. And so we made sure that we had a database of drugs that included not just the name, but what form the drug came in, whether it was a powder there or capsules or tablets. And then we wanted to represent that on the screen itself for the users. And then if you want to take the drug on a specific schedule, which is often important for people, you can set reminders. Now, I've had some people tell me that, oh, well, this app must only be useful for people who take drugs all the time and take a lot of drugs. But it's funny, it's actually kind of the opposite is true, because I find that when I don't take any medication regularly. However, when I need to take antibiotics 4 times a day for a cold or a flu, I end up missing doses, and as you know, that's not something that you want to happen. And so this app will very kindly remind you to take your medication on a regular basis. And I'm just going to call out some of the details here that, again, are going to speak to why the amount of effort that we put into designing this application. And so, for example, this is a reminder screen that you get when you're reminded to take a medication. And you'll notice that there's the time at the top. It shows 8 a.m. So this would be as if I just got my 8 a.m. reminder and I said, okay, let's look at the reminder. And I see here that I have to take 2 tablets of Tylenol arthritis pain. And I have the option to skip it, snooze, or take it. Now, we realize a lot of people just might get this reminder at an inopportune time. They may not be ready to take it right away, but they still want to be reminded. They can skip the dose altogether. They can hit snooze and get reminded in 15 minutes or an hour or 2 hours. Or they can take it and it'll register those 2 tablets as having been taken. Now, we also have reminders, your past reminders, because what you could do is on the iPhone, something to understand about the iPhone and most mobile platforms is that there's all sorts of limitations as to what you can do when you interact with the operating system. Now, something like Android is a lot more flexible than, say, the iPhone. iPhone has kind of more of a walled garden going on. So what someone could do is they could just quit the app without having addressed any of these reminders. So the idea is that we need to be aware of the fact that they may be not addressing these reminders, and we still want to show them because we want to track how many drugs they have in their bottle so we can remind them when to refill their prescription or whatnot. But an important thing to note is that if I've got yesterday's reminder, I shouldn't have a snooze button. And the button shouldn't say take it or skip it because we don't want to convey to the person that they should be doubling up their doses or something. The idea is that you want the verbiage on your buttons to be reflective of what the action is going to be. Now, Apple's really good for this in their operating system. If ever you want some examples, you look at Mac OS or even the iPhone OS. All of their buttons are verbs. It's not, do you want to restart your computer? Okay, cancel. It's restart and cancel. And so there's little things like this that permeate user interface design that makes it a very fascinating field. And so let's start. Like, where do apps come from? Again, I'm going to rely on Drug Hub as our example because I think it's good for you guys to get an idea as to specifically for this app, where did this app start and how do we carry it through to completion? And the other thing is, user interface designers are very, we get called a bunch of different things. Like there's interaction designers, there's product designers, and actually those can be split out into separate roles. However, for example, on the Drug Hub project, I was wearing many hats. And I think it's important for user interface designers to be aware of the fact that being cross-trained in other skills makes for really good user interface designers. Like some of the best designers I've met are people who know how to go from 3D modeling to actually dabbling in some programming, and they do web, they know Photoshop inside out. I mean, you don't have to have all of those skills, but I find that being a well-rounded computer user really helps you design something for your users. So let's talk about product design. This is that first phase where you think of all the ideas you want to have for your app. And so this is kind of some of the ideas that came out of our brainstorming session with Great West Life because they were involved in the development of the application. And they're like, well, these are all the things that we could have an app do. We could do diet and fitness, prescribe drugs, photos of the pills, missed doses, medical dictionary. The important thing to remind yourself, though, when you're designing for a mobile platform is that your users, some of the best apps on mobile platforms are apps that do one thing explicitly well or a few related things very well. And so we knew we wouldn't necessarily be the best medical dictionary. We didn't have the resources, or we didn't feel like if it was something that would necessarily benefit the app. Or things like diet and fitness. I mean, there's already great diet and fitness apps that's an app in itself. It's multiple apps in itself. So what we do is we slash and burn. We get rid of as many of the ideas as we can. And we thought, what are the core principles and core features that we want to do with this application? So reminding people to take their drugs, the prescription drugs, a drug reference so that you could see if you had, another thing the application does is for the drugs that are in the database, it will tell you if there's any contraindications or warnings with this particular drug. And then Great West Life wanted to have consumer tips in there to make people more educated consumers when it comes to taking drugs. Now,
consumers but not purchasers. That's not what this means, right?
I'm sorry?
It doesn't help you with where you should buy.
No, and actually that was one feature that was kind of floated about too. But the idea is that it goes from when you've been prescribed the drug, or it's a drug that you just want to take on a regular basis. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be quote unquote prescribed, but then it reminds you and it has a drug reference. But then we thought, well, actually, what can we boil it down even more to the core purpose, or what is the singular goal that is most important about this app? And that's reminders. And so with a very core driving feature, you can really start to prioritize everything else in the app. So if we know that everything has to come second to reminders, and so reminders are the most important aspect of this application. These are the things that people are going to most benefit from. Yeah, I mean, the drug reference is nice to have, and it's good when you're looking up, a particular drug. But if you've been prescribed the drug, odds are your doctor has given you a pretty good idea. However, you do want to be reminded to take this medication. Flow. So now this is kind of goes hand in hand with user experience. Like I said, there's tons of buzzwords regarding what it is that is involved in the design of an application, but this is essentially just walking through the steps of what are the steps a user has to take to do something, right? In this case, this was add a prescription. So you have your user, they open the app, they have a medicine cabinet, and already we can see here there's some examples of things that were cut from the app as we were developing it. So you can see there's a family medicine cabinet, and then there's search for medication. We at first thought we were going to split the cabinet between a family medicine cabinet and your medicine cabinet. So if you wanted to track drugs for a loved one or something, you would have a separate cabinet for that. But then we thought, well, how many drugs are people really going to be prescribed to, and does it make sense to have them on a separate screen, especially if it adds another step to adding a prescription? Because the idea is that we want to eliminate buttons and we want to eliminate taps and swipes and any kind of gesture, anything that's a barrier between what the user has to do to accomplish what they want to do. And so already you can tell the family medicine cabinet is gone. It's open the app, it goes straight to the medicine cabinet. They search for medication. They're not forced to view the medication info because, again, they may have been taking this drug for 30 years. So straight from search, you can go to add a prescription. So really, it now goes from open app. This isn't really a step. It's just you see the medicine cabinet, you search, and then you can add. And then from there, you can do things like, that was just some additional features there, like assigning a doctor in a pharmacy, which you can do. So if you need to phone your doctor, and you have different doctors for different medications, they're available right there. Mockups. This is what most people associate with user interface design the most. And these are those usually terribly crude drawings. Now, these are made up in an application called Balsamiq. It's a pretty good tool, online tool, that lets you kind of throw mockups together very crudely. The idea is that you don't necessarily want high fidelity for your first round of mockups because you get distracted and you start picking out color schemes and, working on details that aren't terribly important. So these are Balsamiq mockups of kind of how we wanted the app to look, and we go through the different screens. And you can actually link up the buttons. You'll see little arrows here. So you click on them, it actually brings you to that next screen. It's extremely easy to use. They have templates for iPhones and for Android with all the standard items in there, so you don't have to draw them all yourself. Some people like to start on paper or cardboard or sticky notes on a wall. I've done it all. Honestly, I've seen probably, no joke, 50 different ways to mock up the start of an application. And then I like to revise the mockups, go into more detail. The other thing is there's no single right way to do anything. And I'm giving you some examples of techniques and tips and tricks, but honestly, like I said, there's so many different ways to do this. This got to the point where we're trying to get a better feel for the usability, to the point where we want to know kind of how much scrolling there would be on a screen. And we actually ended up building like a web prototype of the app. And I'm just going to point this out. I think that if you know HTML and CSS, that is a huge asset for you being a user interface designer, because it's a great way to prototype things. Like we built this as a web page using a lot of CSS and HTML to make things behave like an iPhone, and you can actually load this up onto the iPhone and try it out. And already, as you saw with the mock-ups there, it's really important to constantly iterate. And so we'll do 3 or 4 times. We'll go over the same set of mock-ups and tweak them and improve them as we go along. And actually, right now, I'll even give you an example of some of the iteration that we were doing. These shelves here that are in the background of the app, this is kind of going to be a time-lapse of, this is the final version. This will be a time-lapse of not every single version, but all the ones that I managed to find. You'll see them. This is kind of the first thing we started at, and actually Patrick did this in 3D, in Cinema 4D actually, to get an idea of what the lighting would look like, or the shadows are like on a shelf. Because there's a lot of little subtle things that you might not pick up on if you don't see it in real life. And actually, oftentimes, I'll just look at physical objects and actually set them down on a table and see how the light wraps around them and how the shadows work. Actually, I'll start the run through, and you'll see all the different examples. Some of them are so imperceptible you can't even tell. Some of them had some crap on them, but so there you go. Containers. This is the different containers that we had for the application. You'll notice that some of them are transparent and some of them are opaque. And that was actually an interesting little challenge. So we had this giant database of drug information. We had spent a lot of time cleaning up, making sure that it was as reliable and as thorough as we could. Which again is another important thing that kind of falls outside of quote-unquote user interface design, but it's just as important for your application. If you're working with data that's garbage in the first place, there's only so much you can polish that turd. And so 4 of the 6 containers are translucent, and I know that the designer is actually muttering under his breath right now because of the fact that we had to cheat perspective to make this even work in the sense of having these 3D looking bottles. So if you go back to the shelf, you'll see that we have kind of a perspective there, but that's a fixed perspective. So when you hold your phone from one side to the other, as you scroll through the shelves, we're not actually tilting the perspective. I mean, that could be something you could try and accomplish, but there are only so many details and only so much time that you have to work on these sort of things. And so in real life, not all of these containers may necessarily be the same size, but for the sake of the application, you don't necessarily want to give more weight to a spray remedy because of the fact that most spray cans are larger than pill bottles. And so as much as you want to strive for a certain amount of realism or skeuomorphism, as we call it in the biz, it's not always to your advantage to do so. And there's a lot of other things, little details here that don't reflect the actual physical container. And now we'll actually go through a same sort of thing, a progression of the pill bottle. This is the first mock-up that was, or the first 3D model that was put together by Patrick to simulate a pill bottle. And so immediately, as soon as we saw this, we thought, well, this is too real and too complex for an iPhone screen. You got to remember that this thing is not terribly large. I mean, the iPhone Retina display is gorgeous and is nice to have a high-resolution display like that. But how much usability are you sacrificing by putting in the amount of details that you might want to put in to make it look completely real? And so, for example, the text on the label, while he got it looking exactly like a real label, it's still much too small to read, and there's a lot of detail in there that's not terribly relevant to the user. And so I'll walk you through the changes. You'll see we go from one point, we go from a clear bottle to a slightly more opaque bottle, because again, you want to be able to see it. You'll notice that the ridges across the top of the lid are realistic to start, but then we realize that you want to actually dial down the detail a bit to make it a little more, and certain highlights are adjusted and shadows. Again, some of these changes are imperceptible. You'll also notice the amount of pills going up and down. And actually, actually interesting tidbit for those of you who aren't privy to or haven't really looked into 3D very much. The actual method that Patrick uses to fill these bottles is a funnel, and he funnels in 3D pills, and they fall. So when I would tell him, okay, you saw those like 100 iterations of the bottle, and I was kind of art directing the project, I said, well, let's change this on the bottle, let's change that on the bottle. He's like, well, I can't assure you that the pills are they actually look different every single time he renders them out. In fact, when we were even in the final stages of prepping the application, I would make a tiny little change, and again, the pills would come out differently because they're actually literally being dropped in there. So, and that's the kind of fun stuff too that you get to do when you're in interface design, because you're covering so many different areas. You get to see some and learn some neat stuff. Screen resolutions. Most of you are probably aware, but some of you might not be, that before the iPhone 4, the iPhone had a 320 by 480 pixel resolution. It is now 640 by 960 with an effective points per inch of 326. Now, these two phones are, in real life, physically the same size. However, that gives you a proportional idea of how many more pixels there are on the screen of the iPhone 4 and the 4S. And so this has now compounded the amount of effort that goes into designing interfaces, because as a user interface designer, we have to take these two resolutions into consideration. Especially, and if you think about it, yeah, the iPhone 4S has come out, and the iPhone 4S has the same screen as the 4, and we're now 2 generations into this new Retina display. However, they are still selling the 3GS. In fact, they're giving it away for free. And so you can't count on, some people are in my field are tempted to just go Retina only, and there might be some cases where your app just won't perform well on an iPhone 3GS or lower, so you might have some reason to exclude those devices, but Apple wants you to design for both of these devices. And so what's happened now is that we no longer really count pixels in terms of a universal size. We use points, and so 1 point on this screen is equivalent to 2 points on that screen, or 1 point is equivalent to 2 pixels there and 1 pixel here. And so that's important to consider when you're talking to a programmer. If you're talking to someone who's developing an application for you, you need to be aware of the fact that if they're talking to you in points, if you tell them you want something to be on your iPhone 4S that you've seen at 64 by 64 pixels, he may talk to you in points, in which case it's 32 by 32 points. Just something to think about.
Do you do different assets for both devices then, and the application detects what it's running on?
Yeah, Apple's actually made this fantastic, of all things, Apple pulled this off pretty brilliantly, in fact, because what they did is they literally doubled the resolution. And so what happens is that the assets that, if you just have your single-size assets and someone launches them on an iPhone 4, they'll look pretty much the same. They won't have twice the resolution or sharpness of other ones, but it'll work perfectly. There's no 1.7 times scaling or something. So the fact that it's exactly double is a very important point. And the other nice thing is that for production designers, again, another role here that's often rolled into everything else is the production designer. That's the person who preps all the assets. And so we, at Black Pixel, I'm fortunate enough now to be on a larger team where we have someone who's exceptionally good at asset building, much better than I am, doing these sort of things. But I always still have, everyone still has to be involved in this in some case. Now, Drug Hub, which is a relatively small application in terms of assets, still has 228 assets. And you can see some of the double resolution versions here. You can tell how much of a difference it is. And oftentimes, you might just have literally just resize the item. However, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. One important thing is that when working in Photoshop, just out of curiosity, how many people here use Photoshop or have worked in Photoshop? I just want to get an idea of, okay, that's what I figured. So I'm actually going to get into, and just for anyone who might be not overwhelmed by anything I've said so far, I'm going to get into slightly more advanced techniques and things that you can actually put to good use if you're already experienced in this field. But I want to give you an idea of a thorough walkthrough of this. And I'm going to get into this a bit more a little further on, but we design our assets in vector. Now, they're in Photoshop, so they're vector shapes. But what's important about that is that when you're resizing things, you may not necessarily want to apply all the same, not everything might be resized the same fashion. And so, for example, all of the, and I'm going to be talking in pixels for the most part, I'll be explicit if I'm going to say points, but on an iPhone 3GS, we might have a 1 pixel stroke around this object with a gradient, maybe a 2-stop gradient, and then this glyph here with a 1 pixel white drop shadow to make it look as if it's embedded into the shape. And then we'll see this little zigzag pattern here, kind of a torn edge. However, so if I just took this and I scaled it up, because it's been drawn with vector shapes in Photoshop, it more or less scales gracefully. An important thing to note too is that your assets have to be exactly twice the size in terms of even the canvas. And so sometimes we might move things around. So let's pretend that this image is on a canvas that sticks out to here with a transparent edge here. We may end up moving them slightly 1 or 2 pixels one way or another between the two assets. However, the physical canvas size of the image still has to be exactly twice the size. And there's actually an interesting split amongst UI designers as to whether they should design starting, because you kind of want to start at one resolution or another, whether you should be starting at Retina, which is the 640 by 960. If you work on a laptop or a small screen, you might actually want to start at non-Retina, and then whether you should build everything at Retina and then scale it down, or build everything at the original resolution and scale up. So let me just get back to the points about how the assets might differ. So you might have a 2 pixel stroke, but when you scale this up, you may find that the number of little triangles is the scale is off at that size, or you might find that they don't fall exactly on perfect pixels. The pixel grid is also something I'm going to get into and drive home in a bit. But you might also find that on the Retina display, since it's sharper and crisper and better looking, you might not need to have as much of an opacity on your white drop shadow, for example, or you might find that your gradient, you want to increase the complexity of your gradient a little bit. So it's not always, it is literally twice the size, but you don't always necessarily want to just resize it and go, especially if you're not using vector shapes, because if you're using raster elements, you want to make sure that everything is as sharp as possible, or else you're not really gaining anything. And what's really clever, that is something that Apple did, is that they've added this, the way that you put these new assets into your project is you add an @2x, like just basically the @ symbol and then 2x to the end of all of your images, and then you just provide them to your, actually even just bring them into the Xcode project. Xcode is the application that you use to program iPhone apps, and the programmer just drops them in, and then they automatically work on the iPhone 4. So as much as we were, upset at having twice as many assets to build, Apple did it in probably the best possible way. Are there any questions? I'm actually going to let you guys ask questions as we go along, or any more questions I should say, because I've already gone through a lot and there's more to come. So if there's anything, you guys can also interrupt me if you, go ahead.
I've got a question. I'm a software developer and I've been working on the web for a year and a half or so now. And I'm curious to know, I use some software in my projects on the web, and I can very easily go and look at the source code and build on top of what previously people have done and all that. And it seems like, potentially the iPhone development ecosystem would encourage much less sharing on that level of the code and so on. So I'm curious to know, what is the actual answer?
Right. Actually, this is an interesting point, because oftentimes people that are getting into user interface design want to see how other people build things or design things, just the same way that programmers want to look at the source code. Like, I'm always right-clicking on a web page and going view source. And so let's say, for example, even go back to those assets. If you wanted to see, well, how exactly are the assets cut up in a particular iPhone application? Now, it's not terribly straightforward. Now, I'll have to ask you to Google it. But if you've bought an application, you have it in iTunes on your computer, there is a method to extract that application. It's very compressed, and in fact, if you if you do it without using a tool, all the images end up looking blank because Apple applies all sorts of compression to them to the point where the PNGs are no longer openable in a standard application, which is kind of interesting. Excuse me. And so it's a great way to learn. And so if you Google and find out how to extract the images from an iPhone app, please don't steal them, because that has happened where people will just rip the assets off and steal them. But if you're curious about to see how they're split up, like if you didn't know how exactly the different images looked like or how they were cut up, that's a good way to do it. And so you download an application, you look at the assets, and you can see how they're put together. As far as programming, if you're a programmer and you want to build iPhone apps, there's a lot of open source stuff out there. It's not that you necessarily can look at the source of an application that's built, but there's tons of frameworks that are free or people are sharing. If you go onto GitHub is a huge repository of code, of source code dumps of people's projects. There's a lot of, like I said, open source frameworks and a lot of knowledge out there, because the iPhone is such a hot commodity right now that everyone wants to learn how to develop for it. So it does have a bit of that walled garden approach to it. However, there are some ways to circumvent at least getting to the images, and ways to learn, but it's really, you have to look at some of the open source projects that are out there and that sort of thing.
Can I ask you a sub-question?
Sure.
So, probably there's some kind of a stat out there that says there's 80% free apps in the App Store, and there's 20%. Do you happen to know if there's a percentage for for open source apps in there for free software?
That's a really good question. I'm not even familiar with the split of free and paid. I know that I'm fairly certain it's more than half of the apps on the store are free. But as far as open source, that's a good question. Like I said, it's mostly, you'll more often find things like frameworks and other similar sort of sub-projects to a project. Like if you're trying to accomplish something, say in OpenGL or in a particular language, you might find that available, but not necessarily the whole app.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
I just was looking at the zero there, and I wanted to ask, obviously a graphic, I'm guessing, but is there a rule of thumb for font usage in iOS apps, like a web safe standard, but for the device?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and I'll actually reiterate just in case everyone didn't hear it, but he was asking about font usage. Now, the iPhone iOS 5 ships with quite a few fonts. I think there's 52 fonts that come with it, and those fonts are freely available to use in your applications. You can embed fonts into your projects, however, you have to get the proper licensing to do that. In the case of this calculator number here, I'm actually going to use as an example later on, but I actually rendered it as they are images, and every single one is hand aligned to the pixel grid, and I'll get to this in a minute, but whenever you're using something like a font that you have to embed into an image, like generally we try and do as much in code as possible. And this is another thing you want to kind of familiarize yourself with, is get comfortable with the programmer or the developer who's working on your project, because you may need to learn a little more code than you're comfortable with. And not so much code, but things like providing them with all the color values of a gradient in the various stops. And you might have to provide them in a color format that you're not familiar with. And so another general thing that's important is to always align your images to the pixel grid. Like, you want to make sure you do not have any blurry edges, because that stands out like a sore thumb. Especially, again, if you want to bring that polish to the level where you want to compete on a world stage, you can't have any of your graphics have that blurry edge. And that's often what will happen when people resize their assets, either up or down, to get the two asset sizes, is that they just do image resize in Photoshop, and they don't necessarily look at the results, because you might have, and this is actually one reason that a lot of people will tout designing at 1x first at the lower resolution, is because you can easily, or more easily, double everything, and things like a 1 pixel stroke will turn into a 2 pixel stroke. However, if you're working purely at Retina, you might have some strokes and fills and sort of things that might be a single pixel or something like that, or once resized will fall between the pixel boundaries, and then you get blurred edges, and then your stuff looks like crap. And so Right, and we'll get to more questions at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity at this point. Let's talk about icons, iconography. Iconography is an art unto itself. I'm actually a pretty terrible iconographer. If I had an unlimited amount of time to do it, maybe I could accomplish something, but it's just not my forte. Now, as a subcategory to icons, there are glyphs. I love drawing glyphs. They're fun. They're kind of a two-tone flat representation of an icon. They're really fun to use, especially if you want to just have like a subtle imprint of something, or if you want to have on buttons. You shouldn't necessarily use full color images and icons on your buttons. So you'll notice, for example, in Drug Hub, I had the shelves and the little pharmacy pestle as glyphs applied onto a button, because the goal is to get someone to press on the button, and the button should be a button in itself. So there's not a whole lot of buttons in real life that have a full color representation of something on them. Like, for example, your keyboard doesn't have a color pound sign and ampersand and everything. They're just glyphs. And in fact, iconography is, like I said, is an art unto itself, to the point where we have a dedicated iconographer at Black Pixel. And before I was at Black Pixel, when we were a team that was too small to even accommodate a full-time iconographer, we would contract it out to someone who does this full-time. And here are some examples of applications just kind of turned into an iPhone app icon. iPhone app icons are also kind of an art upon themselves, because they have to be this rounded rectangle. And a lot of people will try and do clever things with them, like cheat perspective and do things. But these are examples of proper conversions of one icon, of a standard icon that you may have seen on a regular OS X app. Actually, I'll run through it again even, just to give you an idea of what that's Safari's icon. But this is what Safari's icon should look like if it's an iOS app. And so you should really try and flatten your icons out and get someone who knows what they're doing to do your iOS app icon. I mean, I'm not discouraging you from trying it yourselves, because there's probably a whole bunch of designers in the crowd, but I've seen too many apps that ship where someone may have spent 1,000 hours building an app, or even 500 hours building an app, and they cheaped out on the icon. And when you're in an app store with, I'm always behind on the figure, but say 500,000 apps, you can't afford to really skimp out on your icon, because it's one of the few things that people are going to judge your app based on. Like, people do judge an app based on its icon and their screenshots, because there's not a whole lot in the app store to differentiate them from each other. And then let's talk about, again, sizes and resolutions. This is an app icon for a Mac app that I had worked on as well, called Bodega, but and this will kind of cross over into the Mac. On the Mac, as far as Mac OS icons go, they need to be scaled, work at resolutions down from 16 by 16 pixels all the way up to 512 by 512. And in fact, nowadays, the icons we have made are usually 2048 by 2048 at the largest size. And some of the reasons for that are, if you're at the Apple Worldwide Developer Conference, Apple has these huge banners they'll put up, and they'll put app icons up there. But if your app icon isn't the right resolution, they won't put it up there. They won't consider it, because they won't look good, right? And so I wanted to show you kind of how an icon will change from one resolution to another. So this is the original 512 by 512. At 128, it's mostly just scaled down, but it's all, again, everything is hinted to the pixel boundaries. At 48 by 48, well, it pretty much has to be flattened, because the perspective just doesn't work at that resolution. And then at 32 by 32, all the signage is gone. Actually, even at 48, the top sign is gone. And then the 32 and 16, again, they're reduced. And to give you a real idea of the difference, that's our 512 icon. This is our 32 by 32 icon at the same size, same canvas size, but just scaled up. So you get an idea of the amount of difference in the amount of pixels. And actually, here's our 16 by 16. And so again, it looks like crap here at this size. However, once it's scaled down, it looks razor sharp. And that's an important distinction, again, is that you want to make sure to adapt your images for whatever resolution they need to be. And these icons are typically redrawn at every resolution. They don't just take the 512 by 512, scale it down, and then tweak a few things. It's actually pretty much redrawn.
Now, when you say they're redrawn, do they just scale down the vectors and hope they match the pixel grid, or do they do their best to really literally redraw every point?
That's a good question. When I'm when I'm doing this sort of thing, for example, I would probably just take all the signage off, keep all the important bits, scale it down to 16 by 16 just to see what it's going to look like. But then I'll start over with the new shapes. Because, for example, this is going to be really complex, this complex shape here, and it's going to be lost, and it's going to crowd my document and make it, because even when you're working at 16 by 16 and you're at 3200 zoom in Photoshop, you're going to have way too many little shape handles to even like grab and move them around. And so you might scale it down to get an idea of what it's going to look like, but then you will probably start over and just draw, because it's very simple, right? This is just a triangle here, and it's just a different representation. And then again, you want to make sure that everything is aligned sharp. Now, obviously, you're going to have some blurred edges and stuff, but at 16 by 16, it actually looks quite good. And coming back to our Drug Hub example, here are the set of icons that were done explicitly for Drug Hub. We hired someone who's a professional iconographer to do them.
Who did these?
Miles Ponson did these, actually, and he's actually now working for a company called Sencha Touch in California. He was going to school in LA while he was doing this, and now he's been snapped up because he's quite the talent. And so you can see here how each icon, these ones are closer in size. These are the retina and non-retina. So these are 58 by 58 pixels, and these are 29 by 29. And so they may not necessarily be redrawn, but they're certainly tweaked and adjusted. So some of the details are removed from some of these icons as they're scaled down. But we were really happy with the outcome. And again, by not using a stock icon set, and I mean, I don't want to discourage you from using stock icons altogether, because say you're on a tight budget and you just want to make it into the App Store. However, be careful if you're going to have holes in your icon sets or icons that aren't quite appropriate, because you're going to put off your users, even if it's just in a subconscious fashion. They may not be necessarily happy with how that's, of how the application feels when they're using it. So when you get to the point where you're putting as much thought and effort into things as you should when you're getting into this scale of application, you'll find that you're thinking about the things that the users are subconsciously thinking and the things that they may derive from using your application. And so go ahead.
Sorry, do you ever use photos for the icons in terms of starting point or anything, or would you use a photo?
Just for a starting point, because photos have a lot of complexity to them that may not necessarily translate well. I can think of an example being, say, the iPhotos icon for the Mac. That's a perfect example of an app icon that has a photo in it. I'm fairly certain, if I can remember correctly, it's been kind of redrawn and traced over to kind of remove the complexity that might be taking away from it and reinforce the aspects of it that are making it recognizable as a photo. So it's generally pretty frowned upon. I can't think of any good examples of apps that use a literal photo as their icon.
Yeah, I've just seen several that look like they might be photos. Maybe they're just without well done.
Well, and that's the thing too, is that I have a hard time describing the aesthetic that Apple accomplishes in Mac OS X and the iOS. iOS is a bit different because it's smaller and it's got the big rounded corners for example, the app icons. But if you look at their OS X icons, some of them look like 3D or physical photos of objects. However, there's a certain kind of gloss and sheen to them, almost.
Hyperrealism.
Yeah, hyperrealism is a perfect example. Skeuomorphism. They have some of the textures of the physical object, but not all of them. Again, it's a matter of this is why I say it's an art in itself, because there's a lot of things in it that it's not so much getting all the details perfect. It's leaving out certain details that won't benefit. So again, I'm diving into this to a lot of depth, but I really wanted to let you guys know kind of how that works. And so the next phase of the presentation is actually about techniques, and I think this might be a good time to have our break. And so then we're going to dive into some real techniques, and so you guys who are Photoshop experts will hopefully even learn some stuff from the next section.
Cool. We'll take about a 15-minute break. I guess we'll reconvene here.
No more than 15 minutes though. Tops.
We'll be timing you.
Yeah.
If you want to get in on the draw,
Everybody please take your seats. Sit down.
Sitcoms are on tonight. Anything good?
Tuesdays? I don't know. No, there's nothing good. Sit down. This is your captain speaking. Please sit. I'm shushing everyone. I'm a shusher.
There's a lot of good conversation. I had a nice conversation during break. Did anyone else have a nice conversation? Round of applause. Anyone have a conversation? Good conversation. That's good. Nice collaboration going on. Phil, what are we going to talk about in the second half?
I am going to talk about techniques.
This is where the wrestling moves come in.
That's right. I'm actually going to attempt.
Everyone, welcome back. Phil Letourneau. Rocket this.
Thanks, everyone. Even though I tempted fate and managed to crash a demo that's never crashed for me before, I'm going to be attempting a little bit of Photoshop trickery coming up. So let's talk about techniques. Like, what are the things? Like, I'm sure a lot of you out here, like I said, I know that you've done UI design before, whether it's web or even for iPhone. But is there anything that I can teach even a seasoned Photoshop user what to do, how to do something? And again, you might know all these things, but for those of you that are also not even Photoshop users, you might still gain an appreciation for some of what I'm going to go through. So let's talk about color. I had mentioned before, I believe, that we try to do as much on a device as we can in code, because it's faster to draw a gradient in code, let's say from like white to red or something, than it is to make an image of that and then put that on the device. And so oftentimes we will be conveying color values as a designer in a style guide, for example, to a developer. And you don't always have access to that developer in the next room, but there's different ways to convey that information. And so I want to talk to you guys about HSB. HSB stands for hue, saturation, brightness. If you've worked in other mediums or like in the web with CSS, you might use HSL, which is hue, saturation, lightness, more or less the same thing. I have fallen in love with this method of representing color. A lot of you may be familiar with RGB, which is red, green, blue, where you have a representation of 0 to 255 of every color. So how much red there is, how much green there is, and how much blue there is in that color. But what's neat about HSB is that it separates it out in a different way. And so I'm actually going to get involved with these here. Let's just start with just showing you what an HSB value or color looks like when it's written out. There's a degree, and then there's two percentages. And they correlate to H, S, and B. And so this is HSB for white. So we have 0 degrees on the wheel. We have 0% saturation. We have 100% brightness. And that gives us white. And you can see here, this is actually a good graphic, just off of Wikipedia. I probably should have sourced it. But as you go around in the degrees for hue, you get different colors. And that's actually better represented here. So 0 degrees is red. And this is actually pretty much like the top of this. Actually, no, it's more like a cross-section, more like in the middle. Because as you go up in lightness, you go from a dark to white. And then as you go in saturation from the middle outwards, you get more saturated. And so if this were, say, H of 0 degrees still, but 100% saturation, and say 50% brightness, you would get a nice bright red. What's interesting about this is that now if you've worked in print, you might have used CMYK, and if you've worked in web, RGB. But what I love about HSB, and what's important to note, is that when you're designing interfaces, you're often having to work with a whole lot of colors and complementing colors and colors that need to be tweaked, because on a certain device, they might look completely different than what they do on your screen, for example. So I'm constantly tweaking values. As part of that iterate I was telling you about, I'm always changing things by minuscule amounts. And so by using the HSB color format designation, we can do some interesting things. And so here's a color. It's kind of a orange, one of my favorite colors, actually. And this is the RGB representation of that. And some of you may have spent enough time with RGB that you know it intimately. There's also hex, which is my least favorite, which you may recognize with the hash, FF0000, which would be red. Let's talk about RGB versus HSB. And so let's say I've got this color and I'm using it on the phone. It doesn't feel quite right. I might want to tweak it. So I might want to have a slightly lighter, less saturated version or slightly darker. And you can see the RGB values, and those numbers are all over the place. And I have fought through and hand tweaked these thinking, oh, I think there needs to be a little more red in there. Because as a user interface designer, of course, I'm a jack of all trades but master of none. And so, like I said, some of you may have this like tattooed on your arms and stuff. And you might know this. However, if we look at HSB, it's a lot more interesting, in my mind at least, because I know that at 10 degrees, it's always the same hue. And so if I need to make, and again, like I said, with user interface design, you're working with things that you're not necessarily working at reproducing a color photo in print. You're working at making a toolbar and then buttons and then other elements and backgrounds that might be different lightnesses or saturations or brightnesses of the same color. And so these are all the same hue, and by simply changing the other two values, I can accomplish these different colors, and I can kind of do it in my head and very easily relay this information to a programmer, and they can then implement it. So I know that if I need it to be more saturated, I just have to increase this saturation value. And if you work in, like I said, in web and you do CSS, you can use HSL, and in fact HSLA, which is the alpha value, which adds an even more interesting addition, which is 0 to 1 with decimal places of the opacity of the color. So these are also values that iPhone programmers will understand. So as part of this techniques section too, I just wanted to highlight some applications for you guys that you might want to remember or note. So these are two apps that, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, I've got about, I think, 4 different sections, the fourth one being Photoshop in itself for these techniques. And I'm going to demo some of these apps at the end along with the Photoshop demo. So if you want to see what Color Schemer Studio is, I will show you. Color Snapper is pretty easy to explain. It's a loop that lets you pick a color off your screen, but it lets you specify what format you want that color in, if you want RGB, HSLA, hex, whatever, and you can convert between all of them. And it goes without saying these are all Mac apps. So, preview. Let's talk about previewing your design. This is an extremely important thing that I find, strangely enough, some people still don't do, whether it's just too inconvenient or they just don't think it's important. You have to see what your design looks like on the actual device. So I have multiple devices at home. I look at them in Retina and non-Retina. I mean, I'd rather you have a Retina device only if you had to pick between the two than a non-Retina because, again, the trend is going towards all Retina devices. However, this is what a design looks like when I'm working on it. And actually, this wouldn't be representative of Retina because it would actually be bigger, depending how big your screen is. So you're working on a design. Say this is the non-Retina version. You're looking at it on your screen. Your screen has a certain color temperature and calibration to it. You may probably have not calibrated your screen. And you're working away on it, and you've got all this other stuff going on. You don't even know kind of like what the phone looks like proportional to this. So this looks a lot different than this. And it's not as difficult as you may think, as it was back in the day where we used to just save the images out and load them into iPhoto and put them onto our phone to look at them. That was nightmarish. And so I'll also maybe demo one or two of these apps, or one of these apps later on. These are two great apps. There's another one called that I want to call out specifically because it's free. It's called Live View Screencaster. It runs an app on your Mac. It runs a Mac. Actually, that one works on Windows as well. Runs an app on your Mac or PC. You run a free app on your iPhone, and whatever you see on your screen is shown on your phone. However, it's shown in the one-for-one. So you'll get a frame. You'll actually get a picture of an iPhone. You can drag around on your screen, and whatever you have underneath will show on your phone live. The reason I didn't explicitly show that one is that these two apps are newer apps, and they are a little more little better at it, in my opinion. So, and they kind of serve two different purposes. Xscope has a bunch of other tools involved with it, but their recent addition is this mirror mode, where same thing, you get a frame on your screen, or it shows a representation, a portion of your screen on your iPhone at a 1-for-1 ratio, but you can lock that position to the window so that when you move it around, it always sticks to that. Because you might have a desktop full of stuff and you're dragging this frame around to preview your work, and you want it to be pixel precise, and so it's important to be able to do that. Silkscreen is a bit different because it works in that you drag a file onto it, like a PNG or even a PSD, which is super useful, a Photoshop file, right onto this app on your Mac, and again, it runs an app on your iPhone. And when every time you save it, it updates it on your phone. And they're just about to release an update due to critical requests by tons of users to let you have multiple images and flip through them. But for now, it's actually quite useful if I'm working on one big design. I'll drag it onto there, the PSD. I don't have to have a separate area on my screen dedicated to work with that frame that's previewing. I can work however I want, and even at different zoom levels. So if I zoom my Photoshop document, it won't affect what's being output by Silkscreen. I just hit save, it updates immediately on my phone, and I believe it works with multiple devices simultaneously too. That's the grocery list, okay. And right. So again, there are so many techniques that I'd like to impart on you guys, and I guess we'll have to do like a day-long seminar at some point. But animation, this is another very important aspect of designing apps, and this again applies to every platform. And you'll notice this becoming more and more of a trend with Apple's apps. There's a lot of movement, a lot of fluid things going on. Even some of the really clever things that Apple's done with table views, when you're scrolling through a list of something and you get to the end and it kind of bounces, that accordion, that is amazing. That is great. That immediately conveys to the user that there's no more and that you're kind of like, oh, get to the end and then coming back. It's more like real life. There's momentum to things. Things have weight now, and that's another thing you have to consider when you're designing interfaces, is that not only do you have a visual weight, you have almost nearly a physical weight to something. And so now I wanted to continue the Drug Hub theme throughout the talk. This doesn't actually happen on the app, but I wanted to point it out. So let's say if we were going to add a new drug to our cabinet, we could do it like so. Just have it pop in, which may have been cool circa 1999 or something. We could also just have it drop in, which is kind of neat. But I challenge you to bring it to the next level and do something like this, where you might actually drop it into place and it bounces, right? It might.
Beautiful icons.
Yeah. He's available for hire, yeah. So you can get pretty clever when it comes to the amount of, detail you put into your animations and transitions. Now, the iPhone Developer Kit does give you some stuff for free. There's some cool things like, the swiping through screens and flips sliding up from the bottom and those sort of things. You do get that you don't actually have to hand code yourself. But I want to actually point out some tools for this sort of thing too. Two of them, actually Keynote, which I'm using. I actually use Keynote to make that last one, and I even just used Keynote's stock transitions because they happen to have a drop, an appear, and a move. But you'll want to get it a little more finely tuned when it comes to actually putting it into your app. But it's a good way to convey to a developer what it is that they need to do. So Hype is an application that is actually used for animation for the web. It's built kind of like Flash Player, or Flash Pro, I guess. Never use Flash. But, I mean, you can use Flash. You can use Flash for prototyping. Don't use it on the web, please. So for Hype, what's great about Hype is that it outputs to HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which means that you can, time your whole animation, and you can actually send that to a developer, and they can actually even look at the source code. We were talking about looking at source code before, and kind of see all the timing that you put in. Because the things that you might do to create an animation in a tool like this, or even Keynote, where you set the duration of the animation, you're going to have to convey that to the developer, and that's even that much more information you have to give them. I like to do it in CSS with WebKit transitions and WebKit animations. You can set up a whole keyframe animation. Yeah, if you're into animation at all and you're into web, or you want to get into UI design or whatever, or even if you haven't just tried it out yet, and the latest version of Firefox has support for animations now. There's a great way with CSS to animate objects around. It's fantastic. It's great. It applies to all forms of user interface and user interaction design. And so I end up using a lot of JavaScript and CSS to prototype an animation or a feature that I then convey to the developer. Because as things get more complex and we get into animations and everything, it gets that much more complicated to convey to a programmer. Like, I don't know how many times I've been shouting at a programmer over the phone, like, no, it has to bounce, you know, like 2 or 3 times, and it has to get smaller and smaller every time. And I don't want to rag on programmers, but I mean, some programmers are just don't concern themselves with the details that you as a designer might feel are important. And so it's good to have a good relationship with your developer and explain to them why it is that you want this, or what it is you're exactly trying to accomplish, so that you can have a good open dialogue. And I think that the best apps are designed by smaller teams and teams that have a really close relationship between the designer, project manager, developers, iconographers. Like, if you're all kind of in sync with each other, you can accomplish a lot of great things. Now let's talk about Photoshop. And this is going to get me into, after a couple more slides, I'm just going to show you a few quick things that may be useful to you. Photoshop is like my de facto tool. I use it for the majority of my time is spent in Photoshop, actually, outside of doing prototyping stuff on the web. And as I mentioned before, if you're not using vector shapes, you should be, and you should start. Vector shapes are these clever little things here. You'll see that these layers have a mask and then like a fill color to them, and then you can apply all the layer effects you want to them. But this is the best way to build something that, I mean, you can build something that looks perfectly photorealistic out of simple layer effects and gradients and glows. And yes, Kurt, do you have a question?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, why do you prefer like layer shapes as opposed to just going straight to Illustrator?
The reason is that I find that I rely a lot on the layer effects in Photoshop, and I find it difficult to get pixel perfect output out of Illustrator. Now, that being said, I do use Illustrator quite a bit, but what I do is I might draw a more complex shape in Illustrator, and I copy and then paste into Photoshop. And then in Photoshop, I then hand tune all of the, get everything up aligned to the pixel grid. Because it's difficult in Illustrator to consistently get perfect pixel grid. And I'll give you an example coming up with the pixel grid. The numbers on the little calculators type display in Drug Hub, this is what the font, this is the font at, say, I don't know, 18 points. In Photoshop, I did 0 through 9, and this is what I got out of it. And this is what I needed. And so when you're zoomed out, it doesn't quite look as obvious as it does here, but you need to be aware of your pixel grid. You always have to be looking at your pixel grid. So this is how bad this font, this is like straight up, nice, open type font. In Photoshop, once it's converted to a shape, you can tell how badly aligned it is to the pixel grid. And this matters. This looks really bad on a device. And so you always want to grab all these handles and bring them up and snap them to the next to the pixel grid. And so oftentimes when I bring something in from Illustrator, it comes in looking like this. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So wouldn't that have more to do with like your anti-aliasing settings that you can set for your text, or is that really just like something?
Oh, you can mess with the anti-alias settings, but sometimes the output might be too harsh, like it might not nicely do the corners and everything. And just again, let me just reiterate, and sorry, I haven't said this yet, but Photoshop's terrible for type. Like, it's just brutal. It's awful. And in fact, user interface designers specifically, we have a hate on for the text rendering, because your text rendering will never look the same, because it doesn't do the same kind of subpixel anti-aliasing that you get on devices. So I know designers that go as far as to like write out the text, a line of text in, say, TextEdit, like a word processing app on the Mac, screenshot it, and then put it into their mockups. But that's getting excessive. So let's get our hands dirty here. Let's get into some quick examples. And actually, I have a couple of tools that I just think are super valuable in Photoshop that I'd like to show you. And I'm going to try and do this between this screen and that screen. So here's a cloud graphic that I'm working on for a top secret project. And so if we zoom in, you can see my pixel grid here. And, oh, there you go. I can already see. I resized it for the presentation, so you can chastise me later, but you'll see that. Oh, awesome. You'll see that it's not quite perfectly sharp. Oh, please don't crash on me. Okay, let's see if...
Have you tried 3 SSDs?
Yeah, throw more SSDs at it. I don't know if it's maybe even the screen sharing we have going on. But okay, so as you can tell, I've got some... I'm using vector shapes here, and I actually will repeat the shape sometimes because I can't apply more than one instance of a layer effect, for example. Like if I want a gradient fill, I can only do that once. But you'll realize that my cloud has the shape here, and then I have the arrow is a vector shape too, which means that I can tweak it after the fact. I can get it looking exactly the way I want it to. You know what? I think I might even switch apps here. If you guys can handle it, I might switch apps if one is misbehaving. Let me just show you color schemer really quick. This is the app I was talking about when I was talking about color. It's kind of a color picker on steroids. You'll notice how I have my HSB here, so it's very easy for me to change the hue. And then, oh, actually, I need to actually select a color, I think. Okay. Let's adjust the saturation. There we go. So I can adjust the saturation of a color. But what I really love about this app is that it gives you different colors along the same, like I was talking about, the same hue but different brightnesses. For a quick idea, you can drag and drop and make them into a palette, which is important for some projects. And then you can even go into here. I think it's here. And get your triads and split complements. As soon as they show up. A triad is like a threesome, but with colors. So I don't know if you can tell here, but because I think it's literally waiting for it to happen. It's essentially complementing colors along. Like this is old school stuff that if you went to graphic design school or something, you would have learned and maybe done an actual color wheel. There's certain colors that just look good together, and they're actually this app will very easily combine these colors or show you the different triads or tetrads or split complements for a particular color. So again, when you're developing UIs, you have to think about more than just one color at a time, and you're working at combining a whole bunch of elements together, and you want them to all look good together. And so this is why a tool like Color Schemer Studio is great for that. Okay, let's switch back to Photoshop because this guy's being difficult. I might even kill Keynote to see if that's eating up any resources. Okay, so let's go down to, say, 300%. Awesome. Yeah, I didn't want to call it out, but Kurt's doing a screen share there, and he's sucking all my resources on their fabulous Wi-Fi here. Is it off? Remember, don't quit my app while you're at it. Okay. And then, you know what, just for the sake of being sure, I'm going to quit and reopen Photoshop, which is super fast, but actually, now would be a good time to take a question if someone's got
Do you find that the lack of dithering on the layer styles, gradients, bothers you? Do you ever find that you have to use, like, for example, like a gradient fill layer rather than...
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was about the layer styles for a gradient fill. Yeah, I'll often use and whether the dithering bothers me that there's no dithering, it does. And so I'll often use a gradient fill layer, and then make it a mask, a vector mask. And, oh, for crying out loud. So what I wanted to show you guys was this really cool addition to vector shapes if you're already using them. Okay, so let's see if we can get this working. So say I wanted to add a shadow under this cloud here. And so, I could use a layer effect shadow, which would really just put a shadow around the entire edge, like just make it look as if it's sitting flat on a table. But what if I wanted to accomplish something more of like a, like a shadow underneath like this? And so obviously this is a vector shape, and all that's going to come of this is right now it's white, so, and it actually has an inner shadow, but it's going to just be the solid kind of chunky circle someday. Oh yeah, okay, sweet. So if I make it black, and now here's a tool that you may not have, or panel you may not have ever seen, the masks panel. Or you may have seen it, you may have used it with pixel masks, but it has a great ability to work with vector shapes. And so if I go here and I go feather, it gives me a nice soft, and maybe if I kill this background here, as you can tell, my solid shaped circle there is now a nice subtle feather, which gives me a beautiful shadow. What's fantastic about this is that it's still a vector shape. And so I can go in there and grab a handle and manipulate it with the beefy machine that I have here. And it will apply that same feather, and you can even adjust the density of that vector mask and do some amazing things. So I've seen people make icons and graphics that are ridiculously complex looking. We're talking about photorealism and skeuomorphism. And so if I wanted to, if you can see that here, if I wanted to have the subtle sort of glows and highlights, like lighting effects that I have on this bottle in Photoshop, but make them in such a way that I could resize them and not have to worry about pixelization and rasterization. I could do everything in vector shapes, including my highlights and shadows. I can make them whatever shape I want, and then just tweak this feather setting here, and they're fantastic for things like shadows, custom drop shadows, and highlight edges. And so if you want to make a cylinder and you want to have that nice highlight, instead of drawing a complex gradient or something, you can use this. Like this blew my mind when I learned this vector mask and the feathering of vector masks, because that really truly cemented the usefulness of vector shapes for me in Photoshop. And so you may not have known that. Hey! Thank you. Now we have a weird shaped shadow. Yeah, half moon shadow. But again, it's a vector shape, and so I can even go in there. I really should have not tempted fate. Actually, it's on my other screen. And I can still apply all the layer effects. And this is what I was talking about. If you're not familiar with layer effects, get familiar with them, because this is what gives UI all of its little, I'll stay away from Bevel and Emboss, but all the nice little touches, like if we want to have an inner glow, I can make this look pretty bad, I think. What size?
Do you have effects turned off on the layer?
Oh, that'll do it. Thank you. So I can apply these different glows, and everything is just working silky smooth because of the fact that, well, aside from the performance, but I just think this is the best. This is kind of like the de facto for iOS designers. This is what we do now, is we use vector shapes and vector masks, and it just works out super well. Yeah.
And so the layer styles themselves respect the feather of the vector mask. So
right, the mask overrides everything else.
Okay.
So if you feather the mask more, it'll feather everything within that layer. Trying to think of another app I want to show you guys.
Do you know about the mask, the scale as well, when you scale the object? I find in Photoshop sometimes, when you use 5 pixels and then you have a 5 pixel feather.
Yeah.
And then you balloon that to 50, but it's still 5.
Okay. And actually, I meant to call this out during my presentation, but there's a great website by the guys at Bjango. They're an iOS development shop. They've made some great apps and games, and they have a blog. So Bjango is just B-J-A-N-G-O, Bjango. And they have a blog with amazing tips, like more of these Photoshop tips. And they actually have a whole set of Photoshop actions. And some of them are, like you can actually, when you're doing a resize, like if I do, I'm on my other screen here trying to get this beach ball. But if you do, when you're doing certain transform effects, you can set whether it's going to scale the layer styles as well. So yeah, you want to have that on because, so what we were talking about is that if I say I have a button for retina and it's got a 10 pixel inner glow all around it, and when I resize, if I just grab a handle and resize it down to non-retina, half the size, that glow is now twice as big because it won't scale the layer effects with it. So you got to be, you got to watch for that because that will. So part of these actions that they have with Bjango is that their Photoshop action set, they'll have one that says scale by 50% or scale by 200%, and they take into consideration, they try and make it as sharp as possible. Oh, another good tip is if you're, I actually don't know if this is going to work without me. When you're drawing vector shapes, maybe I can bring this toolbar over here. So when you're drawing with the shape tool, which is here, and then you have your different shapes. So for the square, for the rounded rectangle and the rectangle tools, there is an option, a little known option up in the toolbar here, right here, snap to pixels, which means that I can draw a shape at this resolution and it'll snap to the pixel grid, which is super important. And if there's some debate as to whether this is like the quality of the output of these circles, but circles don't have that option, and we're hoping Photoshop's going to add it in the next version. Well, we're always hoping for stuff, right? But if you use a rounded rectangle and you set the radius at something ridiculously huge, because a rounded rectangle still has snap to pixels, you can draw what's meant to be a rounded rectangle, but below the radius size, it'll be a circle, and it'll still snap to pixels. So I find that a useful tip.
Move your cursor off screen and then move it back on. It tends to, oh, there you go.
Weird. Yeah. Oops. Okay. Yeah. And was there any other apps that I had mentioned that you guys wanted to see? I'm trying to think of. I guess maybe I can show you what live view. Okay. And actually, if you have any other questions, you might as well shout them out now because we're sort of getting to the point where we're running out of time. But this is what live view screencaster looks like. And you can actually say view device frame. So I find I turn the frame off because it tends to take up too much screen real estate, and especially if you go and you're not looking at it at Retina display. But at any rate, this is a representation of your device. Yeah, Chris?
So you briefly mentioned about communicating to the programming team. What are you using? Are you using anything special to sort of prepare your notes for the programmers so they can understand what you're going for?
Yeah.
Anything in particular beyond like pages or Omni or?
Well, we generally use style guides, which are kind of similar to what you would do in maybe in the print industry, and you just have to know what it is you need to convey to the programmer. And I guess like things like HSB color values would be a good example. Durations of animations, transitions. I'll often, we'll do a lot of style guides when we're doing client work. When I'm working with the programmer, I tend to make it a little more informal. It's a lot of back and forth. But I make prototypes too, like I was talking about in HTML or CSS. Sometimes it helps a programmer just to see, to feel the workflow. So if you can make up a quick little web page with or even a Keynote file, like we were mentioning Keynote. Yes. Yeah, it really depends on how precise you need to be with things. Because sometimes Keynote is you could prototype the entire app in Keynote in some cases, right? I just have a few last slides I want to get through, and then, of course, spinning.
How many people did it take to bring the Drug Hub app
to fruition? Okay, so we had Patrick on drums, on doing 3D modeling for the pill bottles and such, and he also did help with the shelves and a lot of general stuff.
I made the shelves, thank you.
Yeah, okay, you made the shelves, thank you. And then I was doing a lot of the UX UI. We had actually Rob in the crowd here did some work on it too as a project manager, and we had a full-time developer. So I think it was plus the iconographer. So I guess it was 3 full-time for 3 months, and then 2 part-time for 3 months. Maybe the iconographer is maybe less than that, maybe 3 weeks or something. Well, like I guess in effort, it was probably 3.5 months with meetings and everything, but then it over the course of maybe 6 months. Okay.
So about 5 people.
Yeah. And I mean, these were also senior resources. So they're people that, like, we had done countless apps before then, and we had a lot of experience in the field. So that's a measuring stick there too, is that it was senior developers. I'm going to get through these last few slides real quick. I just want to talk a bit about polish. This is about those little details. You know, it came down to things like having to put a bit of a dark edge around the bottles and such, and they didn't look great when they were on top of a white background or a pure white background, but on the shelf it really helped them stand out. And this actually has to do with what I was talking about, filling the pill bottle. I didn't mention this because of course my demo didn't work, but as you take the drugs, it reduces visually the amount of pills that are in the container and or liquid. And so the reason that we have some of those, and I actually didn't finish talking about why we had some opaque bottles and cans and stuff, was that if you're applying a cream or a spray, you're not applying, they don't tell you, 3 milliliters of ointment or, 2 1-second sprays. And so we couldn't calculate how much there was left in the container. So that was kind of our clever way, or what we thought was a clever way to get around that, was just not have an opaque bottle. And this isn't the only measuring stick for how many pills you have left. We didn't count on you having to go and count how many pills there are there, because it's actually not even representational exactly, because there's only like 5 different states. But as a quick visual indicator, when you just open your screen and you look at your phone, you can tell, okay, well, this is halfway down, this is nearly done, this is empty. So you know at a glance. And is this the sort of thing, like, people often worry about, repeating information or not giving enough details. Well, they don't need the details here. They just need to see at a glance what they have, what they're taking. But then we give them a bit of a hint as to how much there is left in their container. And then, and this is the implementation, of those figures I was showing you on the calculator display, and also a bit of an example of texture, because texture is important. I actually completely neglected to mention that, but it's a whole chapter in itself. Subtle textures, things like noise, when used tastefully, help make things have a tactile feel to them. A good example would be looking at your Apple keyboard or any kind of brushed metal device. You'll notice there's a bit of like a dimpling to it, a fine texture. And when people see that on interfaces, it sort of gives them a bit of real-world tactility. And then finally, if you're looking for inspiration, or if you're looking for designers, or if you're looking to get into the field of design, Dribbble with 3bs.com. It's kind of it's invite only to get if you want to get into the sharing your work, and people do come up with invites and they're available around. But if you can peruse it for free, it's a great resource. Some of the best talent out there is showcasing their work on Dribbble, but it's a great way just to get some inspiration. Yeah, exactly. I spent way too much time on that. Yeah, question?
Vector source images, but the final, they're all PNGs.
Yeah, and don't compress your PNGs. You don't have to use Safer Web or anything like that, because Xcode does it for you, to the point where they actually can't be opened in an image app after. Yeah.
I'm going to make an observation and then ask a question. So when I look at some of the major apps, like I look at, for example, like Dropbox, Evernote, eBay, all of Apple's apps, well, with the exception of like a recent few.
Mm-hmm.
And also Instapaper comes to mind. So these are apps, they're companies that have, near limitless resources for design. And they seem to have made a conscious decision to go with stock Apple controls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're at the opposite end of the spectrum, there's stuff like Path, like Facebook to a smaller extent, the new Twitter app. And those, in my opinion, they're gorgeous. So, I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how do you think these decisions are made in those companies to go with, something that is,
designed incredibly well and has all this attention to detail, put like the color and things like that, and then some companies that just decide to, go with Apple's stock controls, which does give people a lot of that consistency. What do you think?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the question. There was asked, what do I think of the different, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the amount of money in a company and the amount of money they spend on their app and what the final output looks like, whether it's something super custom, very nicely skeuomorphic and all custom textures and buttons, versus something that looks like it's kind of shipped with the phone. So things like the Things app, which is very popular, but it looks like a standard Apple app. Now, there's a bit of a trend, or Apple seems to be sort of getting away from that a little bit with things like Find My Friends, if you notice.
Which got a lot of flack, I think, because a lot of people didn't like it.
Yeah, Find My Friends is Apple's app for sharing your position, your location with your friends, and it's made very skeuomorphic, which means it's very realistic. It has this leather, fine mahogany leather or whatnot, and it has stitching across the app. It's really kind of, a lot of people point and laugh at it because it's extremely skeuomorphic. But I don't know. I think that oftentimes it has to do with the design team that's involved. I think there's no real way to point at a specific thing, because even within Apple, some of their apps come out extremely skeuomorphic and very custom, and other ones are very stock. And I think there should be a separation between completely custom and stock, because there's different things that come into play. For example, Drug Hub, we still use a standard size nav bar. The buttons are fairly similar. The shelf itself, is quite different. But then when you get into the screens with where your drug information is, we use a standard Apple table. And I think a lot of people too forget how bad some of the stock stuff looks like. If you say, I want to make an app that's just all the standard Apple controls, some of them are really hideous. You just you think of the ones that are pretty easy, the nav bar and the buttons, those look fine. But some of the, and the table views as well, are pretty simple. That's just a simple white, your contacts list. But if you're trying to do anything outside of the functionality of, say, Address Book, you're already getting into custom stuff. And Apple will make things that look like they're not custom, but they actually are. And so that's another sort of distinction. But I don't know. I like to try and float in between extreme customization and not. And I also like to try and maybe not customize every aspect of an application if I can avoid it. So maybe, again, using the standard sizes and shapes for things. Because, for example, the minimum tap size on an iPhone is meant to be 44 points square, which means that your human finger is going to occupy about that much space, and that's what Apple likes you to stick to and not go any smaller. And so there's things like that, guidelines that you need to be aware of that may affect your design.
How about user testing?
Yeah, user testing. So the question was about user testing.
I'm going to let Phil pause and take a moment to answer that question while I suggest that, since we'll be wrapping up soon,
I'll fill out your forms. Look what I'm giving away. But I don't think these are from the user evaluations. I think these are presenter evaluation. Please still evaluate me fairly, even though you may not win these explicitly. You may win a toque. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Troublemakers. Yeah, sorry, I've already blanked on the question. We were talking about user testing. That is a very difficult question. We struggle with that. It really depends on the project, among other things. So, for example, with Drug Hub, we spoke to some people who took medication. We spoke to pharmacists. We spoke to doctors, and we worked extensively with Great West Life. It's not always so much about user testing specifically. It's also about understanding what you're trying to accomplish. And so we found that we gained a lot of insight by talking to a pharmacist, even though a pharmacist, we're talking about an app that's meant for consumers, but a pharmacist can tell us, for example, what all the standard doses are, what the important details of a drug are that we could then relate to the user. But we don't do a whole lot of user testing, and to be honest, neither does Apple. And so that's not to say that it's bad, but it's just that it really depends on the project. But I don't put a whole lot of stock into formalized user testing, but frequently, like if I'm working on an app, like I've got some apps I'm working on right now, I'll just hand the phone to someone and see them, watch them use it for a little bit. But I think as you gain experience, you find you need to user test less and less, if that makes sense.
And logistically, can it not be difficult too?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting easier because there's frameworks like TestFlight, which are good ways to send an app out to users, but Apple locks down the phone so much with their walled garden that it's very difficult to get users testing your app. You can't just like very easily send out a beta. And I'm getting into the more of the technical stuff, but it's something to consider if you're a UI designer. It's just there's so many resources out there. There's so many ways to keep the user in mind without necessarily doing quote unquote user testing. So I'm not trying to say that, like, I guess my first thing was put users first, but don't necessarily put them in, have them dictate the direction of the app. And I mean, there's that famous Henry Ford quote that if I did what people wanted, I would have made a faster horse, right? If I listened to what people wanted, I would have made a faster horse instead of inventing the car.
So follow-up question.
Yeah.
So then, once you've released your application, the App Store is like a really terrible place for feedback from people generally. I don't know if anybody has like, well, sure, some people have launched apps here, and you know that if there's like one bug or they're using an old device and it crashes, they'll be like, 1 star, this shit sucks.
Yeah.
And so you know, but like, do you listen? How much do you then listen to the feedback you're getting from users? So you might not do user testing in the development process, but then you
after the fact.
What happens when it comes back?
Well, I guess we kind of prioritize these things, and so, well, first of all, if a user takes the time to write in and tell us about something, then they automatically get more priority. So if you actually want a developer to listen to you, a lot of them will just ignore their reviews altogether because they can't respond that way. If you email them and ask them about something, they will most likely respond. The good ones will. We tend to prioritize, and so if like in terms of reviews, if we see reviews and people are saying it's crashing, then we jump on that and try and figure it out. Of course, you usually have to get information from your user to tell why is it crashing. But we're talking specifically about the reviews people leave on apps in the App Store. And some people have apps that have thousands and thousands of reviews, and so it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on. But there's some cases where you will gain some insight. I guess it's just that you have to realize that the people that people that take the time to really complain about it in that form, you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset of that user. Like, okay, they could have emailed me, or they could have taken the time to find an email address to send me something, but instead they're complaining on this review, which may not be addressed or whatnot. So it's difficult. Yep.
You mentioned one at the start, and I'm trying to explore this, but I'm curious what you guys do, because you say you set stuff up, you can set stuff up using HTML and CSS.
Yeah.
And then send it to your developer. Do you have like certain software that you recommend? Like, transfer over? Is it pretty?
No. Well, it depends how it's done. I mean, if it's done through that hype program I was telling you about, which is basically looks like Flash but outputs HTML, CSS, we might just send them the HTML and CSS files together. What I end up doing is just doing it by hand most of the time, and if it's something relevant to the point where I need them to see, like, say, the timing or something, I might call it out in the code. Or even, again, depends how fancy you want to get. I might have a working prototype that you can use in your browser, and then next to it I might output, like, okay, here's what the animation timing is, and I can just use a variable to show, like, when I tweak it in my prototype, you actually see it. Or I have a slider or something that affects, it really comes down to, like, your skill level. If you're adept at JavaScript, then you can make something that lets the developer change between a few options, slow down the animation to see how it works. But it's mostly about things like in CSS, when you're doing a WebKit animation or Firefox animation, you have a timeline. You say the duration is a 1 second animation. At 0%, this thing is 10 pixels tall. At 100%, it's 20 pixels tall. Developer can literally look at that and implement that, and that gets them 2 steps closer to implementing it the exact way that you want it. And again, I'm talking mostly, like, I didn't even really address games because I don't do UI for games. So this is mostly for simpler animations, but I guess it could apply to all sorts of other applications as well.
What is the trend with built-in web views? I noticed that Android, iPad, and even Java they all have a web view.
Mhm.
The iPad calls it the UI web view.
Yeah.
And what is the trade-off to consider between using HTML5, CSS, in a web view,
Yeah.
in the program, having that built in, and then doing the rest in native? Is there a trend developing in that area? Is it starting to take more serious? I know that Chrome uses HTML5.
That's a great question. I guess the question is about how often and what the limitations of using a web view in an app are. It really depends what you're using it for. Some applications will be, and I guess we're discussing the difference between a native application, which is developed and programmed in Objective-C and coded by a programmer, and which runs code that runs natively on the iPhone, versus actually, I was telling you how I can build an iPhone lookalike app in HTML5 and CSS and actually run it on the phone. Well, you can actually have those compiled into apps, or even do a web app, which looks and behaves just like an app. There are certainly some, and again, I'm not 100% an expert on this, but there are some limitations as to what it can access as far as APIs. It does have certain things like some graphic acceleration, which is nice. Scrolling behavior usually isn't quite the same. It's not quite as fast. We generally try and go native first, and then we'll go into web views. But it's certainly an interesting field. If you're a web developer and you want to build an app for iOS, you could just build a web app which you entirely access via Safari, and then you can add it to your home screen and even hide the address bar and the back and forward. Or you can team up with a developer which may use some native components like the navigation and stuff, and then actually a perfect example would be Drug Hub. I didn't get to show you this screen, but when you go into the drug to see drug information, it loads up a web view which we mimic looking like an app, but it's really just a page full of formatted text, because it was easier to get text formatted from the people we were getting it from with Great West Life as HTML, CSS than it was in core text.
Yep. I'm thinking years ago I designed all kinds of Apple dialogue screens and stuff like that, and I just call them sheets now, and you can swipe them open like this in an area, and just build them all with HTML5 and CSS, because it's your radio buttons, checkboxes, that kind of stuff. And then it's cross-platform right away.
Yeah, you have to be mindful of the traps. Like if you are trying to make an app entirely in HTML and it's an app that's not a fully immersive app, like it's an app that has a toolbar and stuff, well, if you make it look like an iPhone, then you load it into Android, it might work, but your users are going to be put off with the fact that it's not an Android-looking app. Now, of course, you could use a bunch of CSS rules and media queries and all sorts of things to mimic that. It really depends what your app is doing. There's so many ways to accomplish the same thing, but WebKit views are very popular and they're pretty potent, but they do have their limitations.
We'll take one more question, and then I think we're going to do our draws. So,
Yeah, is there anyone else?
When are you coming out with the iPad version?
The iPad version. I'm not involved with Drug Hub anymore. Just to put that out there, it was a fun project with Great West Life. We worked on it about a year ago, and I think now, well, I've moved on from the company. Like we didn't do that app at Black Pixel, and so yeah, I wouldn't be able to tell you when or if or when that's going to come. But it was a fun project. Drug Hub is free. It's still available in the App Store. It has a pretty good rating, and it's super useful. Even if you don't take drugs regularly, you can have it remind you for like your vitamins and stuff if you want.
You guys enjoy that presentation? Thank you very much, Phil. That was awesome.
Thank you.
If you've all had the opportunity to fill out your
If you have a ticket, that's how you.
No, you need to hold on to your end because how do you know that you've won?
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Unless
so
you
what we're
memorized your
gonna-
number.
So you don't want to put those into the draw because then you'll have no way of knowing that you've won.